Oh, it's a big day. You're learning how to factor out a monomial. This is a big one. Okay, you're going to be using this quite a bit in algebra to the end of this year and in algebra 2 and etc. Okay, so one of the skills you really need to have dialed in right now is your calculation with multiplication. You need to be able to find greatest common factors pretty darn quickly. So when I give you three numbers and I ask you what's the greatest common factor between those three numbers, you want to have that down pretty fast. All right, that's the best way to do this, really. A lot of these problems can be done mentally. You're going to look at the three terms, and you're going to be able to determine my greatest common factor is this, write that out, and then you kind of work backwards, like undoing the distributive property. So I have a 9, a 15, and a 12. I want you to stop and just take a second and think to yourself, what's a greatest common factor of 9, 15, and 12? What can all three of those be turned into through multiplication? Well, a 9, 15, and 12 can all be created from a 3. All right? That is my greatest common factor with the coefficients. Now, I also have an x to the fifth, x to the third, and x squared. Greatest common factor, the one that they all have in common, is x squared. There's at least two x's with each one of these terms. So I'm going to say x squared. Now I'm going to put down empty parentheses. This is where you're kind of undoing the distributive property. You want to think to yourself, if I were to multiply my monomial, 3x squared, times three terms on the inside, and I wanted it to turn into this, you have to figure out what those terms would be. So just do it piece by piece, one by one. If I had 3x squared, what would I have to multiply it by here to make a 9x to the fifth? 3 times what makes 9? 3. Now you got to take into play your exponent rules. This is why last chapter was so important. X squared times x to the what is going to make x to the fifth. And that would have to be an x to the third because 2 plus 3 makes 5. All right, make that 3 a little bit more clear. All right, so there's my first term. Now I got to figure out what my second term and third term would be to make 15x cubed and 12x squared. 3 times what makes 15? Positive 5. X squared times what makes x to the third? Just a single x. 3 times what makes 12? 4. X squared, and it's just an x squared. It's staying the same. So 3x squared times 4 would make 12x squared. Notice that now, if I were to do the distributive property with each one of these, boom, 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 I would end up with the trinomial that I started with. So what we have done is we have factored out the monomial, this being the monomial, the single term on the outside of the parentheses. Your answer here is this. Okay, let's look down at this one. I want you at home right now to think to yourself, what is the common factor between a 14, a 42, and a 21? And those of you that have really worked on your multiplication and practiced it, it should pop right into your brain. 14, 42, 21. Greatest common factor is? Yeah, that's right. You get a 7. Okay? All of these can be turned into those numbers by multiplying by a 7. So that is my greatest common factor with the coefficients. But then you need to focus on the fact that I have a z cubed, a z squared, and a z. The lowest one out of these three is z to the first power, just z. So there is a z and at least one z in each one of these terms. So I'm going to pull that out as well. Now that I have my greatest common factor, I can get my empty parentheses. And this is where you undo the distributive property. You're trying to figure out, like, so 7z times what three terms would turn into this? 7z times 7 times 2 makes 14, and z times z squared would make z to the third. I now have a negative 42. Okay, it's negative, so I got to say a positive 7z times a negative 6z. Z and z is going to make z squared. 7 times negative 6 is going to make negative 42. And then last but not least, 7z times positive 3. I already have the z, so there's no need to put a z here, or that would create a z squared, which I do not want. 7z times 3 would make 21z. I have factored out the common monomial. All right? hopefully this makes sense. This is a skill that you need to have pretty solid. You're going to be using it quite a bit in this chapter and moving on. So this is factoring out a monomial. Here is my monomial on the outside of the three terms inside the parentheses. Okay? Good luck on your upcoming test.